Okay, so this is part 2 of equivalent units and process costing, and more specifically cost per equivalent unit and then cost allocation across departments. One thing I'd like to clarify from the part 1 equivalent unit computation, I did not make it clear that equivalent units for direct materials does not have to equal, and most often won't equal, the equivalent units for conversion costs. And they're not going to equal whenever direct materials are added at the beginning of the manufacturing process. And that is typically a simplifying assumption in the textbook problems and in this course. So because materials are added at the start of manufacturing in each department, as soon as they're started, they get 100% of their materials. So I just want to clarify as to what the equivalent units would be in the assembly department for direct materials and for conversion costs. And notice for A units, it's still 0 because there was no beginning work in process. For the B units, it's still 1,400 each. But in C, the units are 200 equivalent units for materials, because once we started 200 and we didn't finish any of them, they did get all of their materials. So it's 200 equivalent units for direct materials, but only 140 equivalent units for conversion costs in assembly. So 1,540 is the total conversion cost equivalent units for assembly department, and 1,600 is the direct materials equivalent units. In finishing, it's 0 equivalent units for units A with respect to materials, because the materials are already added in the prior period. But with respect to conversion, it's still the 120. And then 1,100 for B and B. And then C, again, that change. All the direct materials are added at the beginning, so the equivalent units for the C units is 300 in finishing department. But with respect to conversion, it's only 75. And so the conversion cost equivalent units are 1,295 in the finishing department. And those amounts are going to become important when we start to allocate the costs by A and B and C, which we're going to now see. So let's look at the assembly department, and I've made up an example, which is why it's taken me a while to create this tutorial, because I've been working out the numbers and making sure all my arithmetic works out okay. So in the assembly department, the A units, the beginning inventory of work in process, has 0 costs because there were 0 units. And then during the period, we requisitioned direct materials, and we accumulated costs by direct laborers, and then we applied the factory overhead. And so we have a total cost in the assembly department this period of $12,200. And really that has to get allocated between 2 areas. One, the B units, which were the started and completed, right, and then got transferred out into the next department, which is finishing, and then the costs that remain related to the ending work in process. So for argument's sake, it's $10,955 that were started and finished costs, and that leaves us with $1,245 related to the work in process. But where did those numbers come from? Well, let's look at the direct material cost on a per equivalent unit basis. So if we spent or incurred $4,000 of direct material cost for the period, and we have 1,600 equivalent units with respect to materials, that's the 1,400 started and completed, and all 200 in the ending work in process, right, the C units. That gives us a direct material cost of $250 per unit. Then if we look at the conversion costs, the $6,000 of direct labor and the factory overhead applied gives us $8,200, and the equivalent units for conversion was 1,540 in the assembly department. That gives us a $5.325 cost per equivalent unit for conversion. Let's prove, based on the number of units that were started and completed and then remain in ending inventory, that $10,955 really is the amount that should get transferred out, and $1,245 is what should remain in the work in process for the assembly department. So let's take a look at that. Again, allocating now the costs to the A units, the B units, and the C units. A are 0 because we had no beginning work in process. The B units, right, the started and completed, we have 1,400 with direct materials at $250 a unit and $5.325 for conversion costs. you do the arithmetic, and that's where $10,955 gets transferred out of assembly for started and completed units and gets put into the next department, the finishing department, and we're going to see that in a moment. And then the ending inventory, the work in process, there are 200 equivalent units for materials, and so that multiplied by the 250 gives you $500. 140 equivalent units with respect to conversion, multiplied by the 5.325, and you end up with the ending balance in the assembly department work in process. This is the C dollar amount, $1245. Now it gets even more complicated, unfortunately, in the finishing department. So in the finishing department, there are carryover costs. This is not the transferred in. This is beginning inventory related costs of $2,000. And then in finishing, we added additional direct materials and direct labor costs and factory overhead applied, and we have the transfer in of that $10,955 coming from assembly into the finishing department. So now we have $22,155 of costs that need to be accounted for. Some are going to be going to A, some are going to go to B, and some are going to be left in C. The A are $2,760, and I'm going to show you how and why, and the B, $16,358, and that leaves us with $30,037 as the C. And the A and B, that credit that you see from finishing department, that would be the completion of costs related to the A units, the beginning work in process, and that's going out to finished goods. And the B units, the started and completed, that's all of their related costs being transferred out to finished goods. And then that leaves us $3,037 that's left in the ending inventory of work in process for the finishing department. So how are we going to allocate those costs? Again, we need the cost per equivalent unit. So we take the $1,000 and we divide it by the 1,400 equivalent units for direct materials. We take the conversion costs, the $8,200, and we divide it by the equivalent units related to conversion, the 120 from A, the 1,100 from B, and the 75 from C, and that gives us 6.332. And then we look at the transferred in, which were related to 1,400 units that were transferred in. 10,955 divided by those 1,400 gives us 7.825. And we need that amount because of those 1,400 units, some of them ended up being transferred out as part of finished goods, but some of them are going to remain as part of the C units, right, because they're not all finished. So we need to track the costs for the direct materials, the conversion, and the transferred in. So now let's look at the finishing department A, B, and C costs, just like we did for the assembly department. So for costs for units A, right, we have the carryover cost of $2,000. That pertains specifically to the beginning work in process. So all $2,000 belong to the A units. There was no equivalent units for A in direct materials, right? That's part of what we see from the carryover. So there's 0. And then for conversion, it was 120 units at the materials, or excuse me, the conversion rate of 6.332. And so the A units are valued at $2,760 as they got finished and processed out. The B units are the started and completed, so it's 1,100 units, 1,100 units, 1,100 units times the transfer in value per unit, the direct material rate per equivalent unit, and the conversion rate per equivalent unit. And that's where the 16,358 comes from. So those are the two transferred out amounts, the credit amounts in the T account. And then that leaves us with the C units. And so we have to prove that we have the right dollar amount remaining, right, that we've allocated all of those costs. So the transfer in, the 300 equivalent units at that transfer in rate, 300 units that received all of their direct materials at that rate, and 75 equivalent units at the conversion cost unit rate, and that leaves us with the 3037, which is the ending balance of work in process dollars related to the C units in the finishing department. I really suggest that you listen to this a couple of times and actually take notes and draw the T accounts and sort of accumulate the costs and see how really we've allocated all of the costs across units after we've allocated all of the units across categories. And I hope you'll find this helpful.